The cobblestone streets of post-World War I Hanover bore the scars of a nation fractured. Beneath its surface of bustling markets and rebuilding efforts lurked a darkness that no one dared imagine. Between 1918 and 1924, this quiet German city became the hunting ground of Friedrich Harman, a man whose name would forever be etched into the annals of infamy. His crimes, so gruesome and unfathomable, left a trail of devastation that shocked not just Hanover but the world. Harman, known to history as the Butcher of Hanover, was no ordinary killer. His methods were monstrous, his motives clouded in depravity, and his deeds meticulously concealed until, inevitably, the rot of his sins surfaced. Born on October 25, 1879, Friedrich Heinrich Karl Harman was the youngest of 6 children in a turbulent and dysfunctional family. His father, an abusive and volatile man, shaped Harman's early years with a tyranny that lingered in the boy's psyche. His mother, a woman of frail constitution, offered little solace, and young Friedrich sought refuge in fantasy. As a child, Harman displayed behaviors that troubled those around him. He was withdrawn, prone to fits of rage, and exhibited a fascination with violence. Teachers and neighbors often described him as peculiar, though few could have foreseen the evil that would eventually unfurl. After a brief and failed stint in the military, Harman gravitated toward petty crime. By his late 20s, he had accumulated a record of theft and fraud, punctuated by intermittent prison sentences. Yet these misdeeds were but a prelude to the horrors that would soon consume him. By 1918, Harman had fashioned himself into a figure of trust within Hanover. Working as an informant for the police, he was known for his sharp eye and willingness to ensnare fellow criminals. This guise of respectability allowed him access to places others would never tread. He became a shadow in Hanover's seedy underbelly, blending in with the drifters, the homeless, and the desperate. He also took on the role of a caretaker for young men who had fallen into dire straits. Harman would offer them shelter, food, and the promise of stability. To the outside world, he appeared as a benevolent figure, albeit with an eccentric streak. Behind closed doors, however, Harman's intentions were sinister. It was in the bleak aftermath of World War I that Harman's reign of terror began. Between 1918 and 1924, scores of young men and boys vanished from Hanover's streets. They were predominantly runaways, vagrants, or impoverished youths, those whose disappearances drew little attention. Harman's modus operandi was as chilling as it was calculated. He would lure his victims to his residence under the pretense of shelter or companionship. There, under the guise of kindness, he would befriend them, often plying them with food and alcohol. Then came the moment of ultimate betrayal. His favored method of murder was particularly horrifying. Harman would sink his teeth into his victims' throats, tearing through flesh and cartilage in a frenzied assault. This earned him the moniker the Vampire of Hanover, though his acts transcended even the darkest myths. Once the life had drained from his victims, Harman would dismember their bodies with cold precision. The question of what Harman did with the remains of his victims adds a macabre dimension to his crimes. Police investigations later revealed that he had a grisly system of disposal. The flesh of his victims was discarded in the Lean River, while the bones were often ground into fragments or burned. More disturbingly, there were rumors, though never conclusively proven, that Harman sold human meat on the black market, disguised as pork. This ghastly theory, while speculative, fed into the morbid fascination surrounding his case. Despite the growing number of missing persons, Harman evaded suspicion for years. His role as a police informant provided him with an unearned layer of immunity. Moreover, the chaos of post-war Germany, with its fractured institutions and transient populations, allowed his atrocities to go unnoticed for an extended period. Harman's downfall began in June 1924 with the discovery of human remains along the banks of the Lean River. The discovery sent shockwaves through Hanover, sparking rumors of a serial killer. When bones continued to surface, the police faced mounting pressure to act. The breakthrough came with the disappearance of a 15-year-old boy named Ernst Ehrenberg. Ernst had last been seen in the company of Harman, and his distraught family demanded answers. The police, aware of Harman's criminal history, finally began to scrutinize him. On June 22, 1924, officers raided Harman's apartment. What they found was a house of horrors. The dwelling was filled with bloodstains, clothing, and personal effects belonging to several of the missing boys. Harmon, under intense interrogation, confessed to his crimes in excruciating detail. He claimed to have murdered at least 24 young men and boys, though the true number may have been higher. His confessions were laced with a chilling lack of remorse, as though the acts he described were mundane rather than monstrous. Harmon's trial commenced in December 1924. The courtroom was packed with journalists, spectators, and grieving families. Over the course of 2 weeks, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of his guilt. Harmon, for his part, appeared unrepentant. He described his crimes with a detached calm that unnerved all who listened. On December 19, 1924, Friedrich Harmon was found guilty of 24 murders and sentenced to death. He was executed by guillotine on April 15, 1925, in Hanover. As he faced his executioners, Harmon reportedly muttered, "I am ready," a final utterance as enigmatic as the man himself. The case of Friedrich Harmon remains one of the most harrowing in criminal history. His crimes revealed not only the depths of human depravity, but also the vulnerabilities of a society in turmoil. He preyed on the most marginalized, exploiting their desperation and anonymity to fuel his monstrous impulses. Even decades later, the scars of Harmon's deeds linger in Hanover. The Lean River, once a serene artery of the city, is forever associated with the horrors it concealed. His story serves as a grim reminder of the darkness that can fester when trust is misplaced and vigilance falters. The true horror of Friedrich Harmon's crimes lies not only in their gruesome details but in the fractured psyche that drove him. In retrospect, experts have grappled with understanding what transformed this man into one of history's most infamous serial killers. Harmon's childhood was marked by alienation and violence. His abusive father humiliated him, while his mother coddled him to an unsettling degree. This duality of harsh punishment and excessive indulgence likely planted the seeds of Harmon's distorted relationships with authority and intimacy. In adulthood, Harmon displayed a blend of charm and menace, a Jekyll and Hyde persona that allowed him to navigate both the criminal underworld and the corridors of law enforcement with ease. His sexuality was another complex aspect of his character. Harmon, a known homosexual in an era when such identities were criminalized and stigmatized, moved in secretive circles. He frequented Hanover's gay meeting spots, often targeting young men who shared his vulnerabilities. Some psychologists have speculated that his murderous impulses stemmed, in part, from a deep self-loathing, exacerbated by societal rejection. Yet Harmon's crimes were not simply acts of desperation or rage. His meticulous methods luring victims, murdering them with calculated cruelty, and disposing of their remains with cold efficiency suggest a chilling lack of empathy. He was a predator in the purest sense, driven not by necessity but by an insatiable hunger for control and domination. The city of Hanover, already reeling from the economic devastation of World War I, was utterly shaken by the revelation of Harmon's atrocities. The post-war period had left countless families impoverished, and young men often took to the streets in search of work or escape. These conditions created a perfect storm for Harmon's predation. For years, families of the missing had pleaded with authorities to investigate, but their cries were often ignored. The transient nature of Harmon's victims, a mix of runaways, vagrants, and laborers, allowed him to operate in the shadows. The city's police force, riddled with inefficiencies and corruption, failed to connect the dots until it was too late. The discovery of human remains in the Lean River was a grim wake-up call. Bones, often stripped clean of flesh, floated to the surface in alarming quantities. At first, police dismissed these findings as the detritus of wartime violence. But as the river continued to yield its grim harvest, public outrage grew. Hanover became a city haunted by fear, its residents whispering about the monster who walked among them. When Harmon was finally arrested, the public's relief quickly gave way to horror. The details of his crimes, laid bare in court, were almost too monstrous to comprehend. How could a man so ordinary, so unassuming, be capable of such evil? The trial of Friedrich Harmon was more than a judicial proceeding, it was a spectacle. The courtroom overflowed with reporters eager to document every salacious detail, while curious onlookers gathered outside, desperate for a glimpse of the man dubbed the Butcher of Hanover. Harmon's demeanor during the trial was as unnerving as his crimes. At times he appeared indifferent, even bored, as witnesses recounted the horrors they had uncovered. When questioned about his motivations, Harmon offered no clear answers. He described his killings with clinical detachment, as though recounting someone else's deeds. One of the most chilling aspects of the trial was the testimony of the families of the victims. Mothers and fathers, their faces etched with grief, recounted the last moments they had seen their sons alive. Many of them had been lured by Harmon's promises of work or shelter, only to vanish without a trace. The prosecution painted Harmon as a cold-blooded predator, while the defense attempted to argue insanity. However, psychiatric evaluations concluded that Harmon was fully aware of his actions. The court, unmoved by pleas for leniency, sentenced him to death. As the verdict was announced, a wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Some cheered, others wept, but all felt the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded. Harmon spent his final days in prison, awaiting the guillotine. Despite his impending death, he remained eerily composed. To the end, he displayed a chilling lack of remorse, offering no apologies to the families of his victims. On April 15, 1925, Harmon was led to the execution chamber. Witnesses reported that he faced his fate without fear, muttering his final words, "I am ready, the blade fell," bringing an end to one of the darkest chapters in German criminal history. Yet even in death, Harmon's legacy lingered. His crimes became the subject of lurid speculation, inspiring books, plays, and even films. For years, his name was synonymous with terror, a grim reminder of the evil that can hide behind a facade of normalcy. The fallout from Harmon's crimes extended far beyond the victims' families. Hanover's police force faced intense scrutiny, accused of negligence and corruption. How had Harmon, a man with a criminal record and a known association with vulnerable youth, been allowed to operate unchecked for so long? Reforms were promised, but the damage was already done. The case exposed the vulnerabilities of a society in transition, struggling to rebuild in the wake of war. It also highlighted the dangers of ignoring those who live on the margins, young men and boys whose lives were deemed expendable until it was too late. For criminologists and psychologists, Harmon's case became a subject of study, a chilling example of the complexities of human depravity. His crimes defied easy categorization, blending elements of sexual violence, cannibalism, and psychological manipulation. In popular culture, Harmon's story has been retold countless times, often sensationalized but never forgotten. His name remains a byword for horror, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. Despite the wealth of information uncovered during the investigation, many questions about Harmon's crimes remain unanswered. How many victims did he truly claim? Harmon himself admitted to 24 murders, but investigators suspected the number could be higher. There is also the matter of his rumored accomplices. Harmon was known to associate with other criminals, including Hans Granz, a young man who was arrested alongside him. Granz was initially sentenced to death for his role in the murders, but later had his sentence commuted to life imprisonment. To this day, the extent of Granz's involvement remains a matter of debate. Perhaps the most haunting question is whether Harmon's crimes could have been prevented. If the police had acted sooner, if society had been more vigilant, if the victims had been afforded more protection, could this nightmare have been avoided? The story of Friedrich Harmon is one of unimaginable horror, but it is also a cautionary tale. It speaks to the fragility of trust, the dangers of complacency, and the enduring impact of societal neglect. Harmon was a monster, but he was also a product of his time, a man shaped by abuse, rejection, and the chaos of a fractured world. His crimes were a reflection of the darkness that can emerge when humanity's bonds are broken, and its most vulnerable members are left unprotected. Today, nearly a century after Harmon's execution, the memory of his deeds continues to cast a long shadow. The streets of Hanover have moved on, but the specter of the butcher lingers, a grim reminder of the evil that once walked among them.